Starting off with the first one, we have strength builds. I beat the entire game in my first playthrough with the strength setup, so I can confidently tell you that these are solid picks. They come with tons of damage with a single hit, lots of poise damage, which just leads to getting more crit shots on bosses, and also stun locking guys until you either kill them or run out of stamina, but most of the time, you'll just kill them. There's hardly any flaws as strength builds, but there is one that comes to mind. The weapons usually have a lot of weight to them, so you'll have to level up endurance quite a bit to balance them out to still be able to fast roll. Other than that, strength setups have always been my first pick in every Souls game, and I've never been let down. I think they deserve to be in the A category and not S, just because there's some other builds that make Elden Ring look easy, and anyone that's put in over 10 hours in this game can tell you it's not easy at all. And before I continue on, I want to give a big thanks for today's sponsor, Bloodline Heroes of Lithis. Create your own unique legendary champions by combining bloodlines like elves, demons, demigods, orcs, dwarves, dragonborn, vampires, and much more. With its innovative air system and breathtaking visuals, Bloodline takes RPGs and gacha gameplay to an entirely new level. Also, it's absolutely free to play, so download it now using the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen if you're viewing this on a PC. You'll get a special starter pack that comes with 1 summoning crystal, 100,000 gold, and 100 diamonds. The first 30 players who leave their in-game account ID and username get a free champion, the Luxurant, one of the best mages to carry you in the game. A fantasy world game with visually stunning 3D realistic graphics where you can find yourself the best companions and raise heirs. You can collect tons of new fantasy characters that are released into the game every fortnight with sleek designs. And if that wasn't enough, you can customize your champions by marrying into any 2 bloodlines in the game, such as elves, orcs, demons, demigods, dragonborn, vampires, and more to create over 800 new fantasy hybrids. The hybrids not only inherit their talents and traits, but also their unique appearances passed down from each family tree and merged into one. All players can enjoy battling in the new Guild War on brand new maps, conquer territories with your guild members, and claim rewards to create the most unique hybrid champions called Bloodcraft Legends. The Luxus Tournament is a competitive event where players deploy champions with a goal of winning battles and advancing through various stages. Players who have played the game over 120 days are qualified to join the Luxus Tournament. The tournament features a rotating tournament aura, champion suspension voting, and a qualifying stage where players gain or lose arena points. The top 64 players enter the knockout stage, followed by the final stage and grand finals. Download the game now for free on both Android and iOS, and use my link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen if you're viewing on a PC, and you get a special starter pack worth $20. Moving on to the next one, we got dexterity builds. The first thing I did when putting together a dex build was go straight for the Bolt of Grand Sax, which is one of the best weapons you can use. Basically, a full-on thunderbolt in your hand. They usually do less damage than strength setups, but you don't have to invest nearly as many points into endurance to wield the weapons to still be able to fast roll, and I think that's a huge pro just so you can really focus on leveling up one stat to maximize your damage as soon as possible. Another benefit to dexterity builds are the Ashes of War. You have so many good options to choose from, such as Impaling Thrust, Piercing Fang, Repeating Thrust, Sword Dance, Unsheathed, and Beast's Roar. They're all very dependable options that you can't go wrong with. Also, with dexterity builds, you can put together a really cool looking samurai setup, and I feel like everyone's done that. They're just really strong and fun to use. But anyways, the thing I didn't like about dex builds, well, in comparison to strength setups, they don't have that stun lock effect that you get from heavier weapons. It just means you have to be more alert for whoever you're fighting, because since you can't stagger them, you really need to pay attention to when they swing at you to dodge it, or you're just gonna lose a lot of health. With strength builds, no lie, I kinda just went through most of the areas mindlessly stun locking guys to death. So for that reason, I gotta put it a little bit lower in the B category. I still think they're good setups to make, but not the best. Speaking of the best, next up are intelligence builds. I'm full of a lot of regret whenever I talk about them or put one together, because the first time I tried them out, I was already over 100 hours in the game, and I realized I could have saved so many years of my life due to stressing out from boss fights that could have easily have been resolved with a little bit of magic. The spells, for example, are insanely overpowered. Literally, you can make some of the toughest bosses look like regular enemies with how much damage they do, and I'm not even talking about Comma de Zur, you know, the infamous laser beam of death. The other spells like Comet, Ronnie's Dark Moon, Adula's Moonblade, and the best of all, Night Comet, which is invisible to bosses, meaning they won't dodge it, are all amazing. Even if you don't go the route of using spells and instead decide to use weapons, they also got the best ones to pick, such as the #1 weapon in the game, the Dark Moon Greatsword. You could also use the Sword of Night and Flame, Death's Poker, and I'm sure I'm probably missing a few of them too with there being so many, but in short, there's tons of different options that all do the same thing. Kill anything in front of you easily. And the last thing with intelligence builds is some of the attacks can apply the free status effect, which takes a chunk of health away and then makes that guy take 20% increased damage for 30 seconds. So just stacking more damage and a debuff on top of everything, as if it wasn't enough already. I think intelligence builds speak for themselves, so I'm putting them right at the top of S rank. I honestly don't see any issues with them whatsoever. And I'll probably be saying the same thing about the next one, Faith builds. I couldn't decide on what was more satisfying, using dragon attacks to melt people, conjuring lightning to nuke bosses, throwing fireballs like I'm Super Mario on too many mushrooms, or shooting a laser beam from my eyes like I'm the Cyclops from X-Men. The variety of incantations combined with most of them being extremely destructive, you literally feel like a kid in a candy shop and not knowing what to grab first. I would say the incantations are on par with the spells from an intelligence build, with some of them doing a bit more and a bit less damage. However, the thing it does better than them is having a larger area of effect. It makes it a lot easier to land these on guys that are either jumping around a lot, or if there's just a large crowd of people that you want to get rid of. There's an incantation for every situation, and that's usually about 50% of the builds. The other half usually revolves around the Blasphemous Blade, kind of the only good weapon for a Faith build, but at least it's extremely good though. The only issue I'd say I have with Faith setups is if you go the route for holy damage, most of the holy incantations don't do that much damage, and all of the main bosses in the game are resistant to holy attacks. Not to mention, there's also not too many good options for Faith weapons. I'm still putting this in the S tier. Those other incantations are on the verge of being war crimes with how strong they are. Now the one following that is Arcane builds. I think this one's going to be very interesting. Everybody knows how busted bleed builds were in the early days of Elden Ring, killing bosses in a matter of seconds and proccing so many bleed buildups people would just die instantly. Obviously they got nerfed heavily, but I'd still say they're pretty strong, but how strong exactly? So most Arcane setups are focused heavily on proccing bleed buildups for the most damage, but the thing is they don't only rely on bleed buildups. Weapons that already come with a passive amount of blood loss on them, most people just infuse them with the occult affinity, so the weapon's physical damage scales with Arcane while simultaneously increasing its bleed buildup. You get this nice 2-for-1 bonus with them, and that's not including the special weapons either, which are on a whole different level. Let's take the Reduvia Dagger for example. The Ash of War deals a good amount of upfront physical damage, builds up the bleed status effect for extra damage, and then doesn't even cost that much mana either. Bleed setups are still extremely strong, definitely not as strong as they used to be, but not something to be overlooked. There's tons of great weapons to use with them, and this just leaves me stuck now, because bleed builds are really strong, but I wouldn't say they're as strong as intelligence or faith builds. They're a bit better than strength builds. For this, I think I gotta put it in the A tier. It's like right on the border of A and S, so if you think it belongs in S tier, I can understand your argument for why you would think that. Believe me, I've made a ton of bleed builds in the past, so I know exactly how strong they are. Let me know what you guys think. Continuing on, this is where you're going to see a lot of extremely OP builds and some extremely underwhelming builds, and these are the hybrid setups, splitting levels between two stats, like let's say strength and dexterity, to make an effective setup. And you know what, I think I'll cover that one first. I'm going to start this one off by saying I have tried to make a good strength/dexterity build, also known as a quality setup, and they have never came out good, and I'll tell you the reasons exactly why. Most weapons are going to have a B rating in both strength and dexterity, which honestly sounds really good at first, but after playing around with it, the only way those weapons end up doing more damage than, let's say, weapons that have an A scaling and higher is if you dump a metric ton of points into both stats, to the point where you look at yourself and ask, why am I doing this? I'm tossing out similar amounts of damage, but I need almost 2 times the amount of levels to do so. The only time quality setups become the better option is if you just max out both stats and don't care if you overlevel yourself. I gotta put this in the C tier and not D, just because it has a potential to be better than a pure strength or dexterity build, even though you need a huge investment of levels. One of the hybrid builds that are the complete opposite of this, well, in terms of being effective, are strength/arcane setups. These are insanely busted. You know when you look at something and just go, why is this a thing? But you don't mean it in a negative way, more so like this defeats the purpose of playing a difficult game, but you like it. Picture all the perks of a strength build, you know, tons of damage with a single hit, stance breaking, staggering, and mindlessly walking around bonking everything that moves. And now add in the bleed status effect on top of that. When you infuse strength weapons with bleed, they come with high amounts amounts of blood loss without even putting any points into Arcane, and you only get more after doing so. You're probably thinking, well, the physical damage on it wouldn't be good then since it comes with so much blood loss, but no. Most of them have an A or B scaling in strength, so you get the best traits from both attributes. Also, almost every bleed build has the Lord of Blood's Exaltation and the White Mask equipped that increases your damage by 30% after a blood loss. So if you just add that into a strength build, you're basically doing more damage from the blood loss and then doing even more damage after it because of the buff. You kill everything you come into contact with ridiculously fast. This is going straight in the S tier category, no question about it. Guys, definitely try this one out, you'll have a blast. And who knows, maybe the same can be said for the next one on here, Intelligence/Faith builds. We already know that by themselves they are some of the best setups you can create, but if you combine the two, wouldn't they just become fully overpowered? Well, not exactly. The reason they're so strong by themselves is because you're only focusing on one type of damage, whether that be magic or fire, and it's very simple to buff up the damage of one of them. When you combine the two, it's basically like taking away some of the magic damage to increase the fire damage, or the other way around, and they both just become half decent. So instead of having the laser beam of death or Super Mario's grenade fireball, you get the regular laser beam and kind of a spicy meatball. The damage on them just drops off so heavily, no matter which one you try to use, you're gonna have no luck. The only way this kind of build works is if you use the Sword of Night and Flame, and even then, you're doing so much work to put this setup together just to get some decent damage out of it. I would say this is probably worse than a quality build, because at least with those, you only have to level up 2 stats and then you get some good damage. Whereas with this, you have to level up both Faith and Intelligence to do some damage, then you have to level up Mind in order to cast the spells and incantations, which are gonna consume a lot more mana now since you have to toss out more of them because of their lack of damage, and then you have to get a bunch of items to make the Sword of Night and Flame function well. Intelligence/Faith builds are going all the way down to D tier. I think the idea of a magic and fire or holy based setup would look really cool with all of their flashy attacks, but together that's kind of all you get. A lot of flashy attacks with not so much power behind them. And if you want something that looks flashy but can also do high amounts of damage, maybe a Faith/Strength build is what you're looking for. You can take the perks of both stats, such as the stagger effect and hard hitting weapons you get from a Strength build, and the buffs and damage incantations from a Faith setup. You kind of get a bit of everything with these, lots of damage up close, nuking bosses, a good damaging ranged attack, and a lot of protection through buffing and heavy armor. The issue with these builds is a lot of them are very similar to a pure Faith setup, and if you go the same route by grabbing a fire weapon and a bunch of fire incantations, at that point it's more beneficial to make a pure Faith build because you're gonna get more damage with that. The setup I put together here would look really odd because most of it doesn't really go with each other, but it all works together perfectly. I think Faith/Strength builds are hard to assemble nicely unless you only get a handful of levels in Faith for some buffs and then put the rest into Strength. But that wouldn't really be a hybrid build, it would just be a Strength setup with a tiny bit of Faith. I gotta put Strength/Faith builds in the B category. They may be hard to put together and a bit confusing at times, but the destructive potential they have is there. Alright, let's take a step away from Faith for a minute or two and look into Dexterity/Intelligence builds. The first thing that comes to everyone's mind is Moonveil, the iconic weapon that terrorized everyone in PvP. That's usually the main weapon for an Intelligence/Dexterity setup, since majority of the weapons either have good scaling with one stat and not the other. You could say placing the cold affinity on weapons makes them better, with very few of them having a B and C rating at best, but that's still not enough to make them a viable option. Even with the Moonveil being hit with the nerf hammer heavily time after time, it still remains a pretty good choice, especially when you combine it with spells, more specific Ronnie's Dark Moon. This spell not only builds up the free status effect and also procs it very fast too, but it makes whoever's hit with it lose 20% of their magic resistance. This spell kind of sets up the entire build, so whether you use other spells for damage or the Moonveil, everything's going to be hitting much harder. This is a type of build where both stats complement each other nicely by combining raw damage with a debuff effect. I do think there's some room for more damage and better survivability with these kinds of setups, but I'm still putting them in the A tier. However, something that might combo better with Dexterity is Arcane. Very similar to the Arcane/Strength builds, you get tons of damage, lots of bleed buildup, and kill everything easily. There's also other special weapons to use like the Regalia Straight Sword, pretty much just tossing a blender at people that melts them, but yeah. Dexterity/Arcane setups are very powerful with so many different options to pick from, and the best part about them is if you use straight swords or curved swords, just like weapons that swing really fast, you can stack up attack power incredibly quickly with items that increase your damage with successive attacks. So not only do you increase your damage output with faster swinging weapons, but you'll also proc the bleed status effect faster since you're using weapons that swing faster. This is kind of like the Dexterity/Intelligence build where both stats complement each other nicely, and half of the time, it doesn't even matter what Ash of War you use because they're that strong. strong. And just as a strength/arcane setup, this is going all the way to the top of S rank. There's not too much to be said about it cause all it is a dexterity build, but add a ton of bleed to it. Now I wish I could say the same thing about strength/intelligence builds cause I love both of those stats, but together they just become a big mess. What I mean by this is with intelligence builds, you have to level up obviously intelligence to do damage and then mana to be able to cast the spells frequently. And with the strength setup, you need to level up strength for your damage and then endurance to be able to wield the weapon. But when you combine the two, you have to focus into leveling up 4 stats to make it a viable build. And then even when you do that, you just end up losing a lot of damage because in the end, it just becomes better to focus into one stat and not the other. Like, you could use magic attacks with a pure strength build, weirdly enough, and you can also use strength weapons with a pure intelligence build. It's better to leave them separate, there's just too many things to worry about, so I think I gotta put this in the C category. It's not bad enough to the point where it's unusable, it's just way too much work to put something together that doesn't perform nearly as well as other setups. Don't combine the two, pick one, and you're good. On the other hand, using a Dexterity and Faith build is a really good idea. We already know Dex builds by themselves are okay, you know, nothing game breaking, but when you add in the damage buffs, weapon buffs, and the incantations of a Faith setup, they basically synergize together, making a really strong build. For example, if you use the incantation Bloodflame Blade to add extra bleed and fire damage to a weapon that already comes with a passive amount of bleed buildup, you can proc a blood loss in 2 to 3 moves with the Ash of War repeating thrust. And if you go up against guys that are resistant to bleed and fire damage, then you can just buff it with Electrify Armament instead for extra lightning damage. Most of the damage incantations deal lightning damage anyway, so it's usually best to grab items like the Lightning Scorpion Charm that increase their damage. And I would honestly say these builds are strong enough to make it into the A tier. They're able to pump out pretty high amounts of damage and can easily be adjusted for whatever situation you find yourself in. This setup is very similar to a pure Dex build I put together, focusing on the Bolt of Grand Sax, but I think Dex/Faith builds work much better majority of the time. Coming near the end of the video, we have Faith/Arcane setups. This one was surprisingly really strong, but there was a twist to it. Being half arcane, this means you're going to have access to the occult affinity, just allowing you to make weapons physical damage and bleed buildup scale with one stat. Really good to use weapons that come with a passive amount of blood loss. And with the Faith side, you also get to use the dragon incantations, which are some of the hardest hitting attacks you can use. You get this combination of hard hitting moves at close range and from a distance. Now I said there's a twist to it, and it's that those dragon attacks take a long time to fully cast, and you can't do anything to avoid being hit while it's going on. So most of the time, you're going to need a summoning to distract a boss for a couple of seconds to get the full amount of damage off. I would say this is kind of a small setback since it can easily be fixed with a random summoning of your choosing, but I know a lot of people are going to complain saying, oh, you need a summoning for this build to work, so it's terrible. Personally, I don't think that's a big issue since there's not one summoning that you absolutely need, any would work perfect, and for this, I gotta put it in the S rank for how much damage it can pump out. If you want to put it in the D or C rank because of that, we can agree to disagree and move on to the last build on here, Intelligence/Arcane. Right off the bat, there were no weapons that came to mind or anything at all that scaled with both stats except for the Albinauric staff. This saved the entire build because I was able to toss out some really good amounts of damage without having an insanely high level in intelligence. A third of this damage is due to it being buffed with the arcane side of this setup, proccing a bleed buildup and getting a damage buff, so they both help each other out a lot. The arcane weapons are perfect for up close fighting, doing tons of damage and proccing bleed buildups, and the intelligence part of the build for more spammable ranged attacks. Basically, once you run out of mana, you can either run in with your weapons and cut them down, or just drink some more mana flasks and keep spamming away. I gotta put this in the A tier. You get high damaging ranged attacks and can cut people down easily up close. Well, if you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to check out my other Elden Ring videos. See ya!